It was a moment that would change everything. A single encounter, a brief exchange, and a career built over decades would crumble in an instant. Imagine for a second that you're one of the highest ranking officers in the United States Navy. You've worked tirelessly, facing countless challenges, pushing through barriers that most people would never dream of. You've earned respect, admiration, and the trust of your country. Now, imagine that all of that is put on the line in a single momentary interaction, a moment so surreal that it's almost impossible to believe. This is exactly what happened to Admiral William Craven, a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country with honor and integrity. But it wasn't a military decision that brought his career to the edge. It was a simple arrest at the hands of a white police officer that would set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. The story begins on a crisp morning in a small suburban town. Admiral McCraven, an African American Navy officer, was driving through the neighborhood on his way to meet with a colleague. He had just wrapped up a series of meetings, his mind focused on his duties, as it always was. But what he didn't know was that just a few miles away, a routine traffic stop would quickly escalate into something much larger than anyone could have imagined. As McCraven drove through the area, a police officer, a white man in his 40s, noticed his vehicle. A quick glance at the license plate, a hasty judgment made, and the officer decided to pull him over. The reason? Alleged suspicious behavior. No speeding, no reckless driving, just a gut feeling, a decision made purely on assumptions. McCraven, however, had no idea what was coming. At first, he thought it was a simple misunderstanding, a routine check that would be resolved quickly. But as the officer approached his car, something in the air changed. There was a tension, a sudden unease as the officer's voice took on an accusatory tone. "Step out of the vehicle," he demanded. It was a command that struck McCraven with confusion, but also with a sense of calm professionalism. He had been through countless high-stress situations before, many of them far more dangerous than a routine traffic stop. But what happened next would challenge his very identity, and the path ahead would forever change the course of his life and career. The officer's insistence grew, and before long, McCraven found himself under arrest. The officer cited an alleged threatening posture as justification for his actions, an explanation so vague that it left everyone involved wondering how such a simple interaction could escalate into an arrest of a U.S. Navy admiral. As the officer placed McCraven in cuffs, there was no way of knowing the chaos that was about to unfold. The world wasn't ready for this moment, neither the military nor the public. The immediate aftermath of the arrest was shocking, with news outlets and social media erupting in disbelief. How could this happen? How could an esteemed U.S. Navy officer, who had dedicated his life to serving his country, find himself in such a situation? But this arrest wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symbol of a much larger issue, a tension that had been building for years, an issue that touched on race, power, and the complex relationships between law enforcement and the black community. Graven's arrest was a stark reminder that even those at the highest levels of the military, people who had earned the respect of their peers and the public, could be treated with suspicion, even hostility, because of the color of their skin. But the arrest wasn't the end of McCraven's story. It was just the beginning. The fallout from that fateful moment would have ramifications far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. As the days passed, what seemed like a routine arrest would turn into a national controversy, and Admiral McCraven would find himself caught in the middle of it, trying to navigate a world that suddenly seemed to be against him. Would this single unjust moment be the end of his illustrious career? Or would McCraven find a way to fight back, to reclaim his honor and his place in the Navy? This was no ordinary story. It was a story of resilience, of power, and of a man determined to fight for what was right. But in the next part of this story, we'll dive deeper into what happened after McCraven's arrest, how the Navy responded, and how this incident would change the varied fabric of his life. Stay tuned, because this is a story you won't want to miss. The days that followed Admiral McCraven's arrest were filled with uncertainty. What had started as a seemingly routine traffic stop had now become a media firestorm, and it seemed as if the eyes of the entire nation were fixed on him. News outlets scrambled for details, and social media buzzed with a mix of outrage, disbelief, and confusion. Some questioned how a man of such high rank and stature could be treated in such a degrading way. Others, however, argued that the officer had been justified, that McCraven's actions had been suspicious, and that the arrest was simply the result of a misunderstanding. But in the midst of all this noise, one question lingered. How did this happen? For McCraven, it wasn't just about the arrest itself, it was about what it represented. He had spent his life proving that he belonged, rising through the ranks of the Navy, overcoming obstacles that many people of color faced in a predominantly white institution. The Navy had been his second home, a place where he earned respect and admiration, not just from his peers, but from his subordinates as well. He had seen everything, from the heart-pounding chaos of combat zones to the quiet diplomacy of high-stakes negotiations. He had been a leader, a mentor, and an icon within the military community. To suddenly find himself in handcuffs, with no explanation other than suspicious behavior, felt like a betrayal of everything he had worked for. The police officer who had arrested him was not without his own story. Officer Daniel Carter, a 40-year-old with a reputation for being by the book, had spent most of his career in a small suburban town just outside a major city. He had been raised in the area and had always viewed his job as a protector of the community. But over the years he had also become increasingly jaded, more cynical about the world and the people he was meant to serve. His colleagues often described him as someone who believed in strict adherence to protocol, someone who didn't question his instincts. In his mind, when something didn't feel right, he acted. And in that moment, when Creighton's car had caught his attention, something about the way the Admiral was driving struck him as off. It wasn't anything specific, just a gut feeling. He didn't know who McCraven was, nor did he know the man's background. To Carter, he was just another person on the road, and his behavior was enough to raise a flag. What Officer Carter didn't know, though, was that McCraven had been in that exact neighborhood dozens of times before. He was not a stranger to the area, but to Carter, all that mattered was his training, his instincts, and the sense of unease he felt when he saw McCraven's vehicle. He didn't know who McCraven was, and that was perhaps the most dangerous part of the whole encounter. His decision to arrest McCraven wasn't based on any real evidence, but rather on an assumption that something wasn't quite right. It was a judgment call, one that could have been made differently if he had taken a moment to reassess the situation. But by the time the arrest was made, there was no turning back. Back at the Navy base, McCraven's superiors were receiving reports of the incident, and they were stunned. Those who knew McCraven personally were outraged. How could this have happened to a man who had been nothing but a model officer, a leader who had served with honor for decades? Some questioned whether the arrest had anything to do with race, but that seemed impossible. In the Navy, there was supposed to be no room for prejudice, no tolerance for discrimination. The military prided itself on its diversity, its commitment to equality. Yet here was a black man, one of the highest-ranking officers in the Navy, treated as though he were a common criminal. There were whispers behind closed doors, conversations between military leaders trying to figure out how to handle the situation. There were those who suggested that McCraven should stay silent, that it was best to let the storm blow over. But others felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about one man's reputation. This was about a broader issue. If McCraven could be treated this way, what did that say about the country's understanding of race and power? What message did it send to other people of color in the military or in any institution? The Navy was already grappling with issues of diversity and inclusion, and this arrest threatened to bring all those issues into the spotlight. As the days passed, McCraven's phone rang off the hook. He had offers from lawyers, news outlets begging for interviews, and even a few fellow military officers offering their support. But amidst all the chaos, one call stood out. It was from his childhood friend, Lieutenant Colonel Harris, someone who had served with him for years, someone who knew McRaven, not just as an officer, but as a person. Harris was one of the few people McRaven could count on in times like these. The two had grown up together, both entering the military at a young age, both determined to make a difference. But even Harris, with all his years of experience, was at a loss for words. He could offer his support, but he knew McRaven was facing something far bigger than just a simple misunderstanding. "I don't know how to fix this, Bill," Harris said on the phone, his voice low. "But I'll stand by you. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." McRaven appreciated the sentiment, but he knew there was no quick fix. This wasn't something that could be brushed under the rug. The media had already picked up on the story, and public opinion was starting to form. Some saw him as a victim, others as a man who had somehow gotten himself into a bad situation. But what bothered McRaven most was the uncertainty. He had no idea what the future held. He had no idea if he would be able to continue serving in the Navy, if his career would ever recover from this. Meanwhile, the investigation into the arrest continued. Officer Carter's actions were being scrutinized, and there was a growing divide in the community about whether the officer had acted appropriately. Some saw his actions as justified, believing that he was simply doing his job, but others began to question whether race had played a role in his decision to stop McRaven in the first place. As the investigation unfolded, McRaven's future hung in the balance. Would he be able to clear his name, or would this incident follow him for the rest of his life? The tension between what had happened and what would happen next grew by the day. Every headline, every report only seemed to make things more complicated. There were whispers that McRaven might be forced to step down, that the Navy might make a public statement to distance themselves from the controversy. But would that be enough to quiet the storm? Would the truth ever fully come to light, or would McRaven be left to pick up the pieces of a shattered reputation? For now, all McRaven could do was wait, and as the days turned into weeks, the question remained. Would he ever be able to recover from this moment? The uncertainty hung in the air, thick and heavy, and no one knew how this story would end. The days seemed to drag on as the fallout from Admiral McRaven's arrest grew louder. What began as a singular event, a traffic stop gone wrong, was now a sprawling debate that spanned not only the military but the nation itself. There were those who rallied behind McRaven, seeing him as a victim of a flawed system, while others questioned his version of events, focusing on the officer's actions as justified. But the deeper McRaven looked into the growing chaos, the more he realized that the problem wasn't just about the moment he was handcuffed in that small suburban neighborhood. It was about the wider systemic issues at play, the kind of issues that had been festering for years beneath the surface of American society. The investigation into Officer Carter's actions seemed endless. Every day there were new revelations, and the pressure on the police department mounted. Carter had been placed on administrative leave, pending the results of the inquiry, but the lines between what was considered right and wrong were becoming increasingly blurred. McRaven's arrest had sparked protests, town hall meetings, and debates across the country. There were hashtags trending online, and news anchors dissected every detail of the incident. But what frustrated McRaven the most was how the narrative shifted so quickly. What had once been about him, about his career and the pain of being wrongfully arrested, was slowly becoming about the failings of law enforcement, about race relations, and the country's deep-seated issues with justice and equality. From one perspective, McRaven was being painted as an innocent man wronged by a biased system. But from another angle, he was becoming a pawn in a much larger cultural war. The tension around the issue was growing, and McRaven couldn't escape it. Every interview, every news article, every comment section was filled with opinions, most of them from people who didn't understand what he was going through. Even within the Navy, the conversation had shifted. Officers who had once looked up to him were now questioning his actions. Some believed the officer had acted out of instinct, without malice, and that McRaven should have just complied. Others stood firmly with him, pointing out that his career shouldn't have been tarnished by an officer's overreaction. But none of this answered the most important question. What did this mean for McCraven's future? He had spent decades working to climb the ranks, overcoming every obstacle in his path. He was known for his unwavering commitment to duty, for his leadership, and for his ability to navigate the most difficult of situations. But now, all of that seemed meaningless in the face of a few seconds of tension on the side of the road. The idea that his future in the Navy could be decided by something so arbitrary was overwhelming. It was at this point that McCraven received a call that would shift the course of events. It was from a senior official within the Navy, Admiral Turner, a man who had been a mentor to McCraven throughout his career. Turner had known McCraven since his early days in the service, watching him grow into the officer he had become. Turner was a man who understood the system, who knew how things worked, but more importantly, he knew how to navigate the politics of the military. And it was clear from the start that this conversation wouldn't be easy. "Bill," Turner began, his voice grave, "I'm not sure how to say this, but we need to talk about what's next. This whole thing is a mess, and it's not going away anytime soon." There was a long pause before he continued. "You've got options, but none of them are good. The higher-ups are watching, and there's talk about whether your career can survive this. The Navy doesn't take kindly to native press, especially when it's tied to something as sensitive as this." Graven felt his chest tighten as he listened. This was what he had feared all along, the realization that no matter how much he had given to the Navy, the institution he had served for decades, it could all be torn away by a single ill-fated encounter. "What are you suggesting, sir?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "There's a chance for you to step down, to remove yourself from the equation before it gets worse. You'd save face, and the Navy would avoid more controversy. It's a hard choice, but it might be the only way forward." Turner's words hung in the air, each syllable carrying the weight of a decision that could change McCraven's life forever. McCraven didn't answer immediately. What could he say? To resign now would feel like admitting defeat, like letting the system win. But staying in the Navy, with all the pressure mounting, might make things worse. The public would continue to dissect every part of the incident, and the military might find itself caught in the crossfire. The more McCraven thought about it, the more he realized that no matter what he chose, there would be no easy way out. The decision seemed impossible. Meanwhile, in the small town where the arrest had occurred, the story had become a focal point of division. The local community, which had been relatively quiet in terms of protests or activism, was now divided. Supporters of Officer Carter were vocal, defending the officer's actions and expressing their belief that he had simply been doing his job. They painted Carter as a hero, someone who followed the rules, someone who had reacted to a potential threat. On the other side, people who supported McCraven were quick to point out the systemic flaws in law enforcement, particularly when it came to interactions between black individuals and police officers. Protests began to take shape, with people marching in the streets, chanting for justice and equality. The divide between these two groups only grew, and tensions escalated as local businesses began to take sides. The town, which had once felt like a quiet, peaceful place, now felt like a battleground, and McCraven could feel that battle in every interaction. People who once greeted him with respect now looked at him with suspicion, their views colored by the opinions they had formed based on headlines and social media posts. The same could be said for his colleagues in the military. And then there was the matter of the investigation. Officer Carter's actions were still under review, but as time went on, it became increasingly clear that the situation was far from simple. The more people looked into the arrest, the more questions rose. Was there more to Carter's behavior than just a gut feeling? Had he been influenced by something deeper, some unconscious bias that led him to treat McCraven differently? McCraven didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for sure: there was no escaping the storm. The aftermath of his arrest was changing everything: his career, his relationships, and even the way he viewed the world. He had always been proud to serve his country, to represent the values that he believed in. But now, as he sat at his desk, staring at the stack of letters and messages from people offering both support and condemnation, McRaven was faced with an impossible truth. He was no longer just a man in the Navy. He had become a symbol, a representation of a much larger struggle, one that stretched far beyond his own life. And the road ahead would not be easy. The mystery of what happened that day on the side of the road, why things escalated so quickly, and what drove Officer Carter's decisions, still loomed large. And as McRaven prepared for what would come next, one thing was certain. This story was far from over. The tension was thick, and as each day passed, the weight of the situation seemed to grow heavier on Admiral McRaven's shoulders. He had spent so much of his life working toward this point, and yet here he was, watching it all unravel in front of him. The Navy had always been his home, a place where he had earned respect, where he had earned trust. But now, even as he walked the halls of the base, he couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed. The looks from his colleagues, the whispers in the corners, everything felt different. He had never imagined that the very institution he had given his life to would feel so foreign. The investigation into Officer Carter's actions was still ongoing, but McRaven could feel the noose tightening. It wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about navigating a system that seemed increasingly intent on protecting its own, even if it meant sacrificing someone like him. Every piece of information that came to light about Carter painted a picture of a man who, while dedicated to his job, had made a series of questionable decisions that led to McRaven's arrest. But the deeper McRaven looked, the more he realized how much of this was bigger than just one officer. It wasn't just about Carter's actions. It was about how deeply ingrained biases could shape the way people saw each other, even in the most professional of settings. The media frenzy showed no signs of letting up. Headlines changed from stories about McRaven's arrest to broader discussions about race, power, and the criminal justice system. Some outlets painted him as a hero who had been wronged by a system that still failed people of color. Others questioned his actions, pointing to his military background and wondering if he had been too proud, too dismissive of the officer's authority. No matter how McRaven tried to steer the conversation back to the real issue, the way his career and reputation were on the line, the public had already formed their own opinions. McRaven had tried to focus on his work. He tried to carry on, to lead his team as he always had. But every moment felt like a reminder of how fragile everything was now. His colleagues were less likely to reach out to him for advice. The respect they had once shown him seemed to evaporate. McRaven knew that it wasn't their fault. They were caught in the crossfire of something far beyond their control. But it still stung each time he walked into a room and felt the shift in energy, the careful glances, the awkward silences. Then, just when he thought things couldn't get more complicated, he received an unexpected visitor. It was Colonel Harris, the man who had been with him through it all. Harris had been the one who first called to offer his support, but now, as he stood in McRaven's office, the concern on his face was palpable. "Bill," Harris began, taking a seat across from him, "we need to talk about something important." McRaven looked up, his gaze sharp. He didn't have time for small talk. "What's going on?" "There's talk," Harris continued, his voice low, "about a potential cover-up. Not from your side, but from the police department." McRaven's heart skipped a beat. A cover-up. He had heard rumors, of course. Everyone had. There were whispers of corruption, of police officers closing ranks to protect one of their own. But he hadn't expected it to come to him like this. Not from Harris. "Are you sure?" McRaven asked, his mind racing. He had always believed in transparency, in doing things the right way. The idea that anyone would try to cover up what had happened was chilling. It made everything seem so much darker. Harris nodded grimly. "I've been getting word from sources inside the department. People are worried. There's pressure to spin the narrative in a way that doesn't reflect badly on Carter or the department as a whole." If they can make it seem like McCraven somehow escalated things, if they can twist the facts, it'll be harder for anyone to stand with you. McCraven felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about exposing something much bigger, something that could have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice tight with tension. "I'm suggesting you need to be prepared," Harris said, his eyes meeting McCraven's. "There's more going on here than you think. If this is going to get any better, you're going to have to go public. You have to control the narrative before they do. We need to get the truth out, and we need to make sure the right people are listening." McCraven nodded, but his mind was spinning. Going public was a risk. It could blow up in his face, turn the already volatile situation into an even bigger crisis. But at the same time, staying silent could mean allowing a corrupt system to dictate his future. The stakes had never been higher, and the decision weighed heavily on him. Days passed, and the investigation continued to unfold in ways that seemed designed to keep everyone guessing. Graven's legal team had been working around the clock, trying to build a case that could clear his name. But each piece of evidence seemed to add another layer of complexity. The officer's body camera footage had been reviewed, and while it didn't show anything immediately incriminating, there were small, subtle moments that hinted at bias. Looks exchanged between Carter and his partner, the way the officer had approached McCraven, the tone in his voice. It wasn't enough to make the arrest look blatantly illegal, but it was enough to raise doubts. Meanwhile, the public opinion was shifting. Social media was ablaze with discussions about the arrest, with more people joining McCraven's side as they questioned the behavior of the officer. But there were still those who defended Carter, insisting that the arrest had been necessary, that McCraven had somehow provoked it. The more the public weighed in, the more divided everything became. McCraven had never seen such division in his lifetime, within the military, within the community, within his own country. And yet, despite everything, the hardest part for McCraven was watching his own career slip through his fingers. He had worked his whole life to get to where he was. He had fought for every promotion, every recognition, every moment of respect. Now it all seemed so fragile. One bad decision, one encounter with the wrong person at the wrong time, and it was all gone. He couldn't help but wonder if the very system that had once supported him was now turning its back on him. With the media coverage intensifying and the investigation still ongoing, the pressure was mounting. The clock was ticking, and Craven knew that the moment of truth was coming. The confrontation, the resolution, it was almost here. Whatever decision he made, whatever path he chose, it was going to define the rest of his life. And with the stakes this high, he couldn't afford to make a mistake. The climax was near, and McCraven could feel the storm closing in. What would he do when everything he had worked for was on the line? Would he stand tall and fight, or would he be forced to walk away? The answer was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: this was far from over. Just as McCraven thought he might have a handle on the situation, the unexpected happened. The press conference was set for the next morning, an opportunity for him to finally speak out, to control the narrative before anyone else could distort the facts. He had carefully prepared his statement, hoping it would give the public the clarity it needed. But the night before, as he sat in his office going over the words one last time, his phone buzzed with an alert that made his heart drop. A new piece of footage had surfaced. It wasn't from the body camera of Officer Carter, nor was it from the surveillance cameras nearby. It was raw, unedited, and it showed something no one had expected: McCraven himself in a new light. The footage had been captured by a civilian, someone who had been standing at a distance, recording the interaction from a different angle. It was grainy and blurry, but unmistakable in its implications. The video showed McCraven, his posture tense, his face set in a look of defiance. What stood out, however, was something subtle. The moment when McCraven had raised his hands, seemingly not to surrender but to argue, to escalate the situation. It wasn't as clear as the earlier narrative painted it, but the implication was enough. The video cut off abruptly just before the arrest was made, but that was all it took. Graven couldn't believe his eyes as he watched the footage. He had known the situation had been tense, but he hadn't realized how his own actions could be perceived. Had he really done something that pushed Carter to act more aggressively? Was it his own behavior that had added fuel to the fire? The thought gnawed at him, but he couldn't deny the reality of what he was seeing. The footage now raised serious questions about the power dynamics in that moment, the way his military presence may have inadvertently contributed to escalating the encounter. His calm, controlled demeanor, which he had always taken pride in, was now a double-edged sword. Was this the moment he had miscalculated? And then, just when he thought it couldn't get worse, the bombshell dropped. Graven wasn't the only person under scrutiny. A new development surfaced that threw the entire case into disarray. It was a secret from the past, one that no one had expected to surface, especially not now when everything was hanging in the balance. The military, already under pressure from the public and internal investigations, suddenly found itself in the middle of a new controversy. A report surfaced from a trusted source that Officer Carter, the man who had been at the center of the arrest, had ties to a local extremist group. This group, long suspected of harboring racially charged beliefs, had been flying under the radar, but the connection between Carter and this organization was now undeniable. The details were still sparse, but enough was revealed to turn the case upside down. Suddenly, the question wasn't whether McRaven had been too defiant during the stop. It was whether Carter's actions were part of something far darker, something that could shape the varied foundation of the military and law enforcement. The stakes had just been raised to an entirely new level. If Carter's affiliation with such a group was true, then McRaven's arrest could have been much more than a random incident. Was McRaven the target of a carefully calculated attack? Was this about more than just an officer making a bad decision on a routine traffic stop? The investigation, once focused solely on the actions of one officer, was now spiraling into a much larger web of conspiracies involving politics, power, and hidden alliances. Graven found himself caught in a storm of uncertainty. The public narrative was shifting again, and this time it wasn't just about him. The focus had turned to Carter's background and the possibility that his actions were not an isolated mistake, but part of a far-reaching agenda. If the connection was confirmed, it would change everything. The pressure on the Navy was mounting as higher-ups scrambled to handle the fallout. The last thing they wanted was to be tied to an officer involved in extremist activity. Meanwhile, McRaven's own position was becoming more tenuous by the minute. He had planned to step in front of the cameras the next day and take control of the situation, but now he wasn't sure what to say. The video had complicated everything, casting doubt on his own role in the altercation. The new allegations against Carter made it harder for him to remain the focal point of the story. The narrative was shifting, but where did that leave McRaven? He had spent his life following the rules, staying within the lines, but now those very lines seemed blurred. His instincts told him to fight to defend himself and his legacy, but his conscience told him that there was more at play. But he really ignored the possibility that his actions had contributed to what happened. Was he in some way responsible for the officer's overreaction? The looming question now wasn't just about his career. It was about how much of the truth could actually be handled by the public. If Carter's connection to the extremist group was exposed, it would be a scandal of epic proportions. The Navy could be seen as complicit in harboring someone with dangerous ideologies, and that could unravel everything McRaven had worked for, possibly even his place in history. In the days leading up to the press conference, McRaven found himself grappling with the consequences of his past choices. The pressure of defending himself against the arrest was one thing, but defending the integrity of the Navy, his institution, and his own beliefs in justice was something entirely different. The new revelation about Carter's extremist ties forced him to confront his role, not only in this incident, but in the broader conversation about power, race, and bias within the system he had spent his life in. Now, as the clock ticked down to the press conference, McGraven was faced with an impossible choice. Should he expose everything he knew, risking his reputation and everything he stood for, or should he walk away, allowing the powers that be to clean up the mess without him? He couldn't help but wonder if the entire system had failed him, and now he was the one left to pick up the pieces. The truth was no longer a simple matter of right versus wrong. It had become a tangled web of secrets, power struggles, and a dangerous intersection of public opinion and institutional loyalty. And as McRaven prepared for what would surely be a defining moment in his life, one thing was clear. Whatever happened next would have repercussions far beyond anything he could have ever imagined. The day of the press conference arrived, and McRaven felt as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his uniform, staring at his reflection in the mirror. Everything that had led to this moment, his career, his reputation, his future, was hanging in the balance. He knew the stakes were higher than ever, and yet, even as he prepared to speak, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something, that there was still one last piece to the puzzle that he hadn't yet uncovered. The press room was packed, the energy electric with anticipation. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered to one another, and McRaven stepped up to the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a deep breath, the eyes of the world on him, and began to speak. I stand here today not just as an officer of the Navy, but as someone who has been deeply affected by what has transpired. He began, his voice steady but his thoughts racing. The events of that night were unfortunate, but they have sparked a much-needed conversation about race justice and the systemic issues we face in our society. He paused, scanning the room for any sign of reaction. The reporters were listening intently, waiting for the moment when he would reveal his stance, when the narrative would finally be defined. Graven knew he couldn't back down now, not with the world watching. He had to take control of the story, but at the back of his mind, he could feel the nagging thought that there was more to this than he had realized. The press conference went on as planned. Graven addressed the footage, acknowledged his role in the escalation, and expressed regret for the way things had gone. He didn't shy away from the uncomfortable truth. He had contributed to the tension, perhaps unintentionally, and he knew that he had to take responsibility for his part. But he also called for accountability, not just for the officer, but for the system that had failed to prevent these kinds of encounters. The room was silent as he finished his statement, and for a moment, McRaven thought he might have regained control of the narrative. But just as he thought the worst was behind him, a voice from the back of the room cut through the silence. "Admiral McRaven," a reporter called out, "there's something you need to see." McRaven turned, his stomach tightening. He had prepared for everything. Questions about his arrest, his conduct, even the new footage, but he hadn't anticipated this. The reporter held up a tablet and, with a swift motion, played a new video that sent shockwaves through the room. The video showed a meeting, one that McRaven had never known had been recorded. It was a private conversation, taking place just days before his arrest. The voices were clear. McRaven, speaking with a high-ranking officer from the Navy, discussing the very incident that would later lead to his arrest. But the twist came when McRaven's own words were heard, words that no one had expected. Carter's involvement in this whole thing, McRaven was heard saying, is not as simple as it looks. He's been under pressure from higher-ups. They want to make a statement that favors the narrative they want to push. The room fell into stunned silence. McRaven felt his world tilt as the implications of the video settled over him. The conversation, the one he had thought was private, had now been exposed for all to hear. It was a revelation that threw everything into doubt. Had he been played all along? Was this whole ordeal a setup not just for him, but for Carter as well? The reporter pressed on. "Admiral, what did you mean by this? Are you suggesting that the Navy has been involved in orchestrating the events of your arrest?" Graven stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the question hanging in the air. His mind raced as he tried to piece together what had just been revealed. He had always believed in the integrity of the Navy, in the honor and transparency that the military stood for. But this was something entirely different. The idea that his own words had been twisted, manipulated, or that the Navy itself had orchestrated part of the situation to protect certain individuals, it shook him to his core. As Graven tried to gather his thoughts, another unexpected twist came to light. The high-ranking officer in the video, the one who had been conversing with McRaven, was none other than the head of the Navy's Internal Investigations Department, the same man who had been tasked with overseeing the investigation into the arrest. And now, his involvement in a conversation about Carter, about the narrative, suggested that there had been a much deeper, more insidious plan at play. For a moment, Graven considered his next steps. He could remain silent, try to cover up what had just been exposed, or he could come forward, speak out about what he now suspected, and blow the lid off the entire system. But in doing so, he risked everything: his career, his reputation, even his safety. The stakes had never been higher. Before he could decide, the room erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted questions, demanding answers. The room became a whirlwind of accusations, theories, and speculation. McRaven tried to speak to clarify the situation, but the damage had already been done. The video had thrown everything into disarray. Then, as McRaven stood there, grappling with the storm of emotions, the most unexpected thing happened. The officer who had initially arrested him, Carter, stepped into the room. The crowd quieted, unsure of what was happening. Carter walked straight toward McRaven, his face hard, but his posture resolute. He didn't speak immediately, but instead he handed McRaven a folder. The room watched in stunned silence as McRaven opened the folder. Inside were documents, confidential reports, internal memos, and evidence that suggested that the investigation into McRaven's arrest had been compromised from the very beginning. There were reports showing a concerted effort to discredit McRaven, an attempt to paint him as the aggressor in an incident that was far more complicated than anyone had realized. Carter had been caught in the middle of it all. He had been following orders from above, pressured into making decisions that had not only cost McRaven his career, but also endangered his own future. It turned out that Carter wasn't just a pawn in the system. He was another victim of the very corruption that had threatened to destroy McRaven's life. McRaven looked up at Carter, his mind reeling. This was not the resolution he had expected. The man who had once been his adversary was now his unexpected ally. In a final twist of fate, the two men, both caught in the web of systemic corruption, were now working together to expose the truth. As the press conference ended and the reporters rushed out to cover the new development, McRaven stood at the podium, facing a world that had been turned upside down. The story was far from over, but now, for the first time, he felt as though he might have a chance to make things right. The real battle had only just begun. The days that followed the press conference were a blur of chaos and revelation. McRaven and Carter, now unlikely allies, began working together to piece together the full extent of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed both of their lives. It was clear that the corruption ran deeper than either of them had anticipated. The Navy, the very institution McRaven had spent his entire career upholding, had become a breeding ground for political maneuvering, cover-ups, and dangerous ideologies. But it wasn't just the Navy. It was the broader system they had both worked for, one that had been built on principles of justice and honor, but was now tainted by power struggles that manipulated people for their own gain. McRaven knew that this battle wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about exposing the truth, no matter the cost. He spent the following weeks working closely with a team of trusted allies, lawyers, journalists, and even former military colleagues who had always believed in his integrity. Together, they sifted through documents, analyzed recordings, and pieced together the narrative that had been hidden from the public for far too long. The footage from the press conference, the secret recordings, and the internal memos all told a chilling story of how individuals in power had used McCraven as a pawn in a much larger game. The story was explosive, and soon it caught the attention of not just the media, but also government officials, investigative bodies, and even the public at large. What had begun as an isolated incident involving a military officer and an arrest had now evolved into a full-blown investigation into corruption, manipulation, and abuse of power. Graven was no longer the only one under scrutiny. The system that had allowed such actions to occur was now the target of a nationwide reckoning. Carter, too, was caught in the whirlwind of consequences. While some saw him as a hero for coming forward with the information that helped expose the truth, others saw him as a betrayer. His association with extremist groups, though not confirmed beyond suspicion, had already placed a stain on his reputation that would take years to undo. But in the end, Carter had made the right choice. He had come forward, risked his career, and helped McCraven uncover the layers of corruption that had poisoned the institution he had sworn to serve. As the investigation gained momentum, it became clear that those responsible for orchestrating the events of that fateful night, the ones who had pushed Carter into making a decision that led to McCraven's arrest, would be held accountable. Several high-ranking officers were removed from their positions, and some faced criminal charges. The Navy began the long and painful process of rebuilding trust, not just within its ranks, but with the public. It was a humbling experience for an institution that had once been revered for its discipline and honor. For McCraven, the road to redemption was not easy. He had lost much in the process: his position, his reputation, and the respect of some of his closest colleagues. But he knew that this journey was about more than just himself. It was about the future of the Navy, about ensuring that the mistakes of the past were never repeated. He used his newfound platform to advocate for change, pushing for reforms that would make the Navy more transparent, more accountable, and more aligned with the values it was meant to uphold. Months passed, and the media frenzy surrounding the case slowly began to die down. Graven found himself reflecting on the choices he had made, on the lessons he had learned through the darkest moments of his life. He had always believed in the principles of duty and honor, but now he understood that those ideals were meaningless without accountability. The corruption that had existed within the ranks of the military had been exposed, and the fallout was something no one could have predicted. The most difficult part of McCraven's journey, however, was the personal toll it had taken. He had always been the one in control, the one who guided others through difficult times. But in this moment, he had been forced to confront his own vulnerability, his own role in the events that had unfolded. The public scrutiny, the pressure, and the uncertainty had pushed him to the edge, but in the end, he emerged stronger. He had rediscovered his commitment to truth and justice, and more importantly, he had learned that sometimes the right thing to do was not always the easiest thing. As for Carter, his story was one of redemption in its own way. He had been a man caught in a system he couldn't control, a man who had made mistakes but who ultimately chose to stand up for what was right. In the end, his decision to come forward had not only helped McCraven, but had also sparked a broader conversation about the need for reform within law enforcement and military institutions. Carter's future was uncertain, but the choices he had made would define him for the rest of his life. The aftermath of the scandal left both men scarred, but also changed. McCraven had come to realize that the pursuit of truth and justice was a path fraught with challenges, but it was also one that could lead to meaningful change. The system that had once seemed invincible had shown its cracks, and McCraven was determined to be a part of the effort to rebuild it from the inside out. As McCraven walked through the halls of the Navy's headquarters for the last time, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. The man who had once been the embodiment of discipline and duty had been brought to his knees, but now he was standing taller than ever. The Navy would never be the same, and neither would he. But the changes that had begun were a reminder that even in the face of scandal and adversity, there was always room for redemption. In the end, Craven's career had crumbled in an instant, but from the wreckage he had built something new. He had uncovered the truth, exposed the lies, and ultimately helped to push the military and law enforcement institutions toward the kind of accountability that would prevent the mistakes of the past from happening again. The battle was not over, but McCraven knew one thing for sure. He had made a difference. The story of the white cop and the black U.S. Navy Admiral would be remembered as a turning point, not just in the careers of the men involved, but in the way society viewed power, justice, and the systems that were meant to uphold them. In the end, it was a story about the strength to stand up, the courage to face the truth, and the determination to fight for a better future, no matter the cost.